Joining Polycon UK webinar. Today we have Mathilde Emeriau from LSE, who is going to present Learning to be Unbiased, evidence from the French Asylum Office. We have two announcements. First of all, this is our penultimate talk. In 2 weeks, we will have the last seminar before the summer break, and that will be Helios Herrera from Warwick. The second announcement is that our organizing committee will be joined by a new member. It is my pleasure to introduce Andreas Tegman from Warwick, and you will see more of Andreas hosting some of the seminars after the summer. Very briefly about the format of the seminar, you know this by now. We have a 50-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute discussions and questions. Normally we request our attendees to keep your microphones muted, but since there's no co-author today, if you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask live. But of course, there will be some opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A at the end. If you are shy or don't want to be recorded, you can also type in chat. We will monitor chat. The talk is recorded. After the Q&A, that is at the top of the hour, we'll finish the official part of the seminar. We will stop the recording, but please stay and chat informally. And Mathilde, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. So I'm excited to present this work on part of my work on integration and discrimination of refugees in France. And so this is a project I started in second year of grad school in 2014. Since then, over 3 million refugees arrived in Europe, generating one of the worst political crises in a long time. And at the center of this crisis, judges and asylum officers across Europe have to decide asylum claims. And so how do they make those decisions? So back in 1951, member states agreed to grant asylum to refugees, and in particular to those with a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, or political opinion. And this, until today, still provides the basis of the common legal framework for asylum policy across the world. Now, several features of this system sort of compromise a purely merit-based attribution of refugee status. So the first one is that asylum policy directly interferes with political interests, such that we might expect a political actor to intervene into the asylum process and sort of bias those decisions. And so the second aspect is that the subjectivity of this definition, combined with the suspicion that asylum seekers might be falsifying claims, especially since the 1970s, after the closing of the borders in the European Union. And all of this combined sort of creates a substantial amount of discretion in the hands of those bureaucrats and judges making asylum decisions. And this aspect is best summarized in the word of a former director of the French Asylum Office, who was at the head of the administration at the end of the 1990s. And so in a film interview recorded by the lead archivist at the French Asylum Office, this is what he remembered telling asylum officers. There is a huge stack of rocks, and in the stacks, there are a few gold nuggets, which you have to find, but there are lots of rocks. And so in a few sentences, he nicely illustrates the discretion involved in making those decisions. And so the question that I'm interested in is, what do we know about how those decisions are made? So existing work suggests deviation from the Geneva Convention. So on the one hand, we have a number of studies looking at and showing that strategic interests explain country-level acceptance rates. So it's done primarily in the US and looking at explaining variation in acceptance rate by country of origin by a number of variables, including one that measure both the humanitarian situation in the country of origin and strategic interest. But without micro-level data, we cannot really rule out that these patterns are instead driven by an observed variable. And so on the other hand, we have another set of studies looking at and who diagnose some substantial between judge variation in setting where, like in the US again, where cases are assigned supposedly randomly to judges, such that we would not expect substantial variation in acceptance rate between judges. But again, without micro level data, we don't know much about either the type of applicants that are driving this variation, nor about the type of judges who are driving this variation. And so what I do in this study is complement the set of study by looking at instead how the individual characteristics of asylum seekers might affect acceptance, asylum acceptances. And so I zoom in on the French case, and which is particular for many reasons and interesting for many reasons. The first is because this is the first and probably still today one of the only country to open its archive, only country in Europe to open its archive to researcher, which they did in 2009, and releasing 1.5 million asylum applications to the research community. Beyond that, this is also an important case because France was among the first countries to ratify the Geneva Convention, and quantitatively, it's also an important receiving country. At least in the last 10 years, maybe with the exception of the refugee crisis, it was in the top 3 list of receiving countries of asylum application. And so what I do in this study is asking whether there is discrimination in the attribution of refugee status in France. And so for that, I digitized 4,000 asylum applications from 1976 to 2016. And I find discrimination on the basis of religion, education, and skill level. Maybe more interestingly, what I find is that bureaucrats also stopped discriminating after about a year on the job. And so, which is, I think, a novel finding that deserves an explanation. And so something I try to elaborate a bit in the end. So let me start by giving you some quick background on the asylum decision process in France. So after being admitted in the territory, asylum seekers have 21 days to file an asylum application at the French Asylum Office, where everything is centralized in their offices, in their office in Paris. In this application, the asylum seeker has to provide details about their individual case, as well as a personal narrative, which they have to write in French, detailing the reason why they need asylum in France. The claim is then assigned to a division within the French Asylum Office, and those divisions are organized by nationality. And then within those divisions, then the division head assigns the case to an asylum officer. And while we don't know much about the assignment process, it's most likely based on observable characteristics of the case, because this is done quite quickly, well before the interview when one takes place. And so the asylum officers in charge of the case reads the application and decides, until 2006, has to decide whether to interview the applicant. Interviews are mandatory since 2006. This is an important point for the research design, and I'll come back to this later. And so in this decision process, after reading the narrative, the asylum seeker then go through the interview and then make a proposal and a recommendation to a supervisors, who then decides to follow the recommendation or not. Again, we don't know much about the proportion of decisions that are recommendations that are followed. And we have anecdotal evidence of cases where, in instances in which the proposal of the asylum officer was not followed, but that remained, I think, a marginal aspect. And so the decision they have to make is to either grant refugee status on the basis of the Geneva Convention, or if the application and the applicant does not fulfill the criteria for the Geneva Convention, can make a recommendation for the subsidiary protection or to reject the applicant. And I come back to this distinction later. Those rejected can then appeal the decision in front of the National Court of Appeal of Asylum, and at this stage, the acceptance is still quite important. But in this study, I focus on the first decision, the one that's highlighted here in red and green, and the one that's taking place at the French Asylum Office. This is the one that's relevant for all asylum seekers trying to enter France and ask for asylum. And the second reason I focus on this first decision is because once we reach at the appeal stage, I don't have the same data that would allow me to apply the same research design. So that will become clear later as well. So that's an overview of the decision process. So in 2009, the French Asylum Office opened its archive, releasing 1.5 million asylum applications. And so unfortunately, the Asylum Office keeps track of all of these records in their administrative database, which just a limited number of information about those applicants, like gender and age and the decision, of course, but we don't know anything else about the application. So what I did is sample 4,000 asylum application for in-depth data collection in order to create this database of asylum applications. So a few words about the sampling, which was made difficult by the fact that the French Asylum Office started destroying some of this record, and obviously they did not do so randomly. So they started to destroy rejected application in order to make space in the archive. So I have to account for this in the sampling. But since I have access to the whole population of asylum applicants since 1952, this is something that's manageable. I also oversample application since that were filed after 1989, because those are the nice application you can see, and the files are much messier before. And so I started in 1976 because, as you see, even though the French Asylum Office is created in the 1950s, basically the bulk of their activity then is to sort of regularize asylum seekers who entered the country before, but then the activity quickly sort of trickled down until the 1970s, when the Geneva Convention, sort of the Bellagio Protocol, ratified in the 1970s, sort of removed the geographic and time limitation that were initially applied to the Geneva Convention. So starting in the 1970s, only can asylum seekers from anywhere in the world for any type of event apply for asylum, whereas before the 1970s, it was restricted to events that took place in Europe in the 1950s. So that's the reason. And you see that basically before that, there is not much going on. And so that's why I start in the 1976, and then I end in 2016, which is when the data collection was taking place. And so this is what the application form looked like. So I mentioned that this has both data on individual characteristics. And so you see here on the top, it's asking for your the language you speak, your religion, your education, profession, and then a ton of other things, like the country you went through, the date you left your country, how you entered France, etc. And it also contains a narrative, personal narrative, in which the applicant sort of explains the reason they need asylum. And so this was part of the work, was to enter all of this data, including transcribing those narratives. And so that took a team of about 30 research assistants over 18 months. So, but only five research assistants could work at a time. And so this is the research in action here in the basement of the French Asylum Office. And so in total, that's a data set of 4,000 asylum applications, including, as mentioned, personal information and the transcript of the narrative. And then in addition to that, I also know the anonymous identifier of the bureaucrat who decided the case. So I also requested access to data about the bureaucrat, but this was denied. My request was denied. I think they wanted to protect those bureaucrats. And so I don't have any information about them. Except, as you see, like their history of decisions, basically, because I have their identifier. And I also know the decision to grant or deny the case. So that's for the data. Yeah.
A couple of questions quickly. I know you said that you don't really have much information about how bureaucrats are allocated to cases, but do you have anecdotal stories about, I mean, is it based on country of origin? Maybe there's like a Sri Lanka specialist or something like that? Is it based on easy cases, go to new people, difficult cases, go to experienced people? And the second question is, are there any quotas here involved at all? Or, I mean, I'm guessing it wouldn't be legal to have a quota as such, but is there some anecdotal evidence of quotas being in play or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with respect to the assignment of cases, this is really difficult to know and to tell something like a credible story about how it actually happens. Like, I wasn't able to talk to division heads, but I am very confident that this is only based on observable characteristics. So basically what happens is that the division head gets the pile of, so divisions are organized by country. So all the new applications arrive on your desk and you have to assign those cases. And you're not going to spend more than a couple of seconds just assigning those cases. And if you are going to look inside the case, you're only going to assign those cases based on what you have in the file, which is also what I've access to. So I cannot tell the story of how they do it. Like, I know that, like, yes, of course, asylum officers specialize by country, but even in this, they start with basically 2 countries. So that's for the recent process. So recent asylum officer, I know from the one that were hired recently, they start with 2 countries and then gradually add a number of countries. It's unclear how it happened in the past. I haven't found any systematic evidence on this. But so, yeah, I can't tell the whole story, but this is not a problem for the research design that I go in depth now. And then the quotas, yes, it would be illegal, but it did happen in the 1970s with the refugees from Southeast Asia. And in that case, it's documented, and it's most often in the file that those cases are accepted on the basis of the fact that those were from this origin. And so what I do is exclude those cases from the sample. So I restrict the sample to applications that were decided on the basis of the merit, supposedly decided on the basis of the merit. So what that means is that I also exclude cases of family reunification. So if you apply for asylum and you're married to a refugee, already recognized refugee, then in that case, your application is fast-tracked and the 2 cases are tied, and the decision of one applied to the other. So in that case, I also exclude those cases. And similarly, I exclude the quota refugees.
Thank you. Thank you.
So moving now to the research design. So I basically define discrimination as a causal effect. And I said that there is discrimination on the basis of characteristics if 2 conditions are met. The first one is that first, this characteristic should not alone have an effect on the decision. And so that means that's the reason why I focus on religion, education, skill level, proficiency in French. And I look at whether there is discrimination on those characteristics. For some characteristic, it's not straightforward whether that condition would apply. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't analyze country of origin fixed effects, for example, because they combine both information about the situation in the country of origin and maybe other types of interests like strategic interests, diplomatic interests. But it's impossible to really disentangle. So what I do is to take a conservative approach and assume that everything that is not in those 4 characteristics is basically justified. I'm not saying this is justified, but I'm saying, like, even holding all of these other things constant. So I focus on those characteristics where we can agree that they should not themselves matter. Of course, they're going to be correlated with things in the file that are going to explain the decision, but in themselves, they should not explain the decision. And so, of course, the second condition is that the decision would have been different had the application been the same, with the only exception of this characteristic. And so what I do is simply using a standard design to estimate discrimination as the difference in the probability of getting refugee status that is caused by the presence of the characteristics in the file, or else being equal. So it's a quite standard procedure, but I argue that it's particularly well suited to the context of this study for 3 reasons. The first one is that I have access to the entire file. So basically everything is the files that were not destroyed. So the one that I have access to the entire file. And the second reason is, yes, you should be thinking, yeah, but she said there were some interviews. So yes, of course, that is a problem in this setup. But I also leveraged the historical sort of depth to use the fact that 40% of applicants in the sample did not go through an interview. So while I do the analysis on the full sample, I can check that those results I have are not driven by the fact that applicants do go through an interview during which some characteristics may be revealed that I cannot control for. So in the data collection process, I did collect transcript of those interviews. It's actually quite hard to use in the analysis in any form. And so I haven't been able to use them so far. And the last and the third sort of reason that makes, I think, this research design particularly credible in this case is that the decision to grant the Geneva Convention is based, at least in France, on individual claims of persecution. And so France has adopted this individual interpretation of the Geneva Convention, which is that it's not enough to say that you're coming or you are from a particular group that is persecuted, but they take it very seriously that you should then provide the proof or a narrative that outlines why you yourself were a victim of a persecution. And so in that case, it sort of rule out that I can rule out that the decision is entirely driven by outside information that is based on group characteristic of the applicant. So that's a bit of the overview of the research design. And so in practice, I estimate the following regression.
Mathilde, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So based on this individual persecution, I'm still not 100% convinced that why religion should not matter in these decisions. Like
why
religion should not matter in these decisions.
Why religion should not matter?
Yeah,
of course. No, yeah, of course. So something I did not, so reminds me, I did not mention that. I mentioned that the French Asylum Office is granting asylum based both on the Geneva Convention and the subsidiary protection. What I just said about the Geneva Convention is not true for the subsidiary protection. In that case, if you show that you're coming from a region in which the conflict is going on, that is enough ground to be granted asylum. So what I do is, because asylum is granted, cases are examined sequentially. So you can only be granted subsidiary protection if you were denied asylum on the basis of the Geneva Convention. I basically recode and code applicants that were granted subsidiary protection as not having had asylum, and I focus on the Geneva Convention. But that doesn't answer your question, but I think it's something I should have mentioned here. To your question about why religion should not matter, yes, that's why I focus in this presentation on religions, because that's the more contentious one. And you see that I have additional robustness tests where I look at the fact that, because when I presented the result at the French Asylum Office, they were like, well, yeah, of course, like Christians are more persecuted than Muslims, and this is what explains your finding. And so I do some tests to get at that. The bottom line is that this is actually cases that are applicants that are claiming asylum for religious reason is actually a very small minority. It's only about 6% of cases. And so what I try to do is try to exclude them from the sample and check that the results hold. So yeah, you're right. That's a bit of a caveat that I should have mentioned. So moving now to the estimation strategy. So simply using OLS regression, leveraging the selection unobservable assumption, the dependent variable is equal to 1 if the applicant was granted asylum. So again, 1 if the applicant was granted asylum on the basis of the Geneva Convention and 0 otherwise. And then I control for both applicant characteristics. So in addition to the one I'm interested in, I control for country of origin, year of arrival, gender, age, marital status, as well as time spent in France. So in addition to the one I put special attention to. And now the difficult part was to control for the narrative, right? So it's one thing to say that I can observe the narrative. It's a second to be able to control for it in the estimation. And so that was really the bulk of the that was really with the difficulty of the analysis. And so what I use three different strategies. The first one was to basically those strategies vary on, basically the idea is that there are some underlying dimension of the text that could matter for explaining the decision and that I want to control for. And the strategy vary in different respects. So in the first strategy, what I say is I said that there is one dimension of the text that mattered, and that this dimension is the fact that the narrative is making credible claims of persecution. And so following that, I have research assistant reading a sample of narrative, encoding narrative based on whether they're making credible claims of persecution. And then using supervised learning, I extend the coding to the rest of the corpus. So a few things here. So those research assistants who read and coded those narratives are the same assistant that digitized those files, and they did this at the end. So by the time they're reading those narratives and coding whether they're credible or not, they've read and transcribed hundreds of narratives. They came from a sort of a similar background to asylum officers. They have master's level degree in law or political science. And so that's the strategy that I use in the main specification, because that's the more interpretable one. Now, of course, you cannot rule out that those research assistants themselves are biased, and that this would also introduce some would be problematic for the analysis. And so the additional strategy I use try to alleviate those concerns. So the second strategy is to say there's not one dimension of the text that matters, but several. And basically what I'm doing here is just controlling for anything I can measure about the text. So this includes obviously the length and the number of dates and locations. So the idea here was to control for things that, based on my discussion with asylum officers, things of the text that should matter. So how detailed, how original, how personal, and obviously the content. So I try to control for length, number of dates, and location. I try to control for originality using some distance measure to other narrative from the same country of origin. I control for the number of pronouns. So here the idea is basically if the text is gonna explain away those results, then I should try to control for as many things as I can about the text. And then the last strategy is, I think, the most credible one is to say, okay, there's not one dimension, there's several, but I'm gonna have this algorithm discover those features. So instead of saying I know what those features are, I have this algorithm discover those 8 text feature in a split sample, in a partition of the sample, and then analyze them, and then predict those features in the rest of the sample and control for that. And so what I'm going to show you is just using those 3 different strategies to control for the text. But this is an overview of the different strategy I used to control for that.
Can I ask a question about a bit of a context about this text? So I understand, apart from the text itself, those applicants do not have to or do not normally submit any other evidence like pictures or documents that attest, for example, prison sentence, because in principle you could validate the narrative by providing evidence. And the second of all, it seems, is there a skill of writing? Do those applicants know how to write an application? For example, if you have a friend who applied successfully, you could copy from them or something like that. is there a concern at all? You know, this skill and information spreading, you know, among people applying to how to say it, not manipulate, but game the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they can and sometimes submit additional pieces of evidence, and the application form contains a photo. So everything, we collected everything. So it's difficult to collect data on those evidence. So I did collect, you know, the type of documents that are submitted, but they're quite messy to analyze. And so something else I could do would be to also control for the number of pieces of evidence, but it's not something that is easy to control for. So the photo are in there, and we digitized them all, and it was supposed to be part of a separate analysis. It turned out to be quite impossible to code as well, in terms of you know, what about those pictures that should matter. So this is standby yet in terms of the analysis. And then, yes, like applicants, my feeling would be that applicants do well know what is successful, how to write a narrative, because they, though we don't know the proportion, we know that it's common to use some, you know, writer who would know about, you know, successful story. So that was supposed also to be part of a different project as well. I was interested in understanding the dynamics of those narratives and whether they do respond to decisions. So do we see, the idea was to look at, do we see a narrative coming up more and more often after it's been successful? So I haven't started that analysis. Now, to your point about whether it is problematic for the this research design, I would say no, because what matters here is that we're not trying to measure persecution itself, but just control for the effect of the text. And so the fact that it might be a narrative that looks similar to other is something I try to capture with this distance measure, and it's basically, I think, what I have in mind in terms of the learning mechanism, in terms of bureaucrats sort of being more able to identify cookie cutter narrative and the ones that are coming up more often after they've seen a couple, basically. So I don't think it's problematic for the analysis.
Thanks.
And so just showing you the main result, just focusing on religion so far. So this is what the naive difference would look like. So just comparing the acceptance rates among Muslim and Christian. And then controlling for applicant characteristics mentioned above, and then controlling for the different way of controlling for the text, basically. So I find that Muslim compared to Christian are less likely to receive refugee status. The magnitude is about, so it's 5 percentage point estimate, which is quite substantial. The average acceptance rate in the sample, it's an underestimate of the acceptance rate at the French Asylum Office for diverse reasons I mentioned, but in the sample it's 15%, and so it's quite substantial. And so I'm going to show you now the results for the other characteristics. So this is the results from a single regression, looking at the different characteristics I set out to study, also controlling for, in addition, country of origin and application year. And so what I find is that so Muslim compared to Christian are less likely to receive refugee status. Those who completed primary education are less likely to receive refugee status compared to those who completed graduate education, who started graduate education, and then similarly with those with lower skill level are less likely to receive asylum compared to those with high skill level. And so this is sort of the main result from the paper, but I do, as mentioned, an additional series of robustness tests. And I focus on the Muslim result because that's the most contentious one. And so
Mathilde,
yeah,
just a clarification question. So how the French Asylum Office asks about religion, or is this something you extract from the text?
no, that's from what they.
I'm quite surprised they do.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's in the form, like between education and occupation, basically, and the language as well. So I only analyze characteristics that were asked and that can sort of quickly be retrieved. Of course, like the narrative could mention it as well, but I don't use that as a source of coding.
And what's the proportion of people who reply, who actually declare a religion?
Most of them.
Most of
so
them.
I don't have there's going to be some missing, of course, and but I don't have the raw number. But in the paper, it's reporting. So yeah, some it's missing, but it's actually quite well documented for sure, and it is. So that's also another contribution of this study. It is the only administration in France who collects data on religion.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, actually.
Yeah. So that's then the reporting here, the results from the main specifications, so controlling for credibility of the narrative as measured using the first strategy. So what I do a number of things. So I basically try to use additional estimation strategy, so controlling for additional characteristics, so not the one I mentioned, but in addition, do they have a refugee family member who is refugee in France? Do they report different documents in their application, like a passport, diplomatic laissez-passer, or any kinds of information that I could extract from the form? The idea here is to say, like, is there anything else from, basically I have this main specification where I selected the variable that I thought should intervene or could explain the decision, but now I'm trying to also control for anything else possible, controlling for country year interaction, and even in the case of looking at religion, just focusing on a match sample of Muslim Christian from the same country of origin who arrived within 3 years of arrival. So that reduces the sample size, but the effect is much stronger. And so after that, I also control for the result. I also control for and actually subset the sample for whether applicants were interviewed or not. So looking here at just a subsample of applicants who did not go through an interview, controlling for bureaucrat fixed effects. And then, as mentioned before, I do two things to get at this sort of question, which would be, yes, like, sure, like this is because Christians are more persecuted. So what I do is two things: is control for religious minorities, so combining information on the religion of the applicant and the religious breakdown in the country of origin. So religious minority here is equal to 1 if the applicant is from a religion that is making up less than 20% of the population in this country of origin. The last one was a bit harder, the idea was to say, if we think that those results are driven by the fact that Christians are more persecuted than Muslims, then we should not see this difference sustained in the subsample of applicants that did not claim religious persecution. And so that was quite hard to do. This is not any data that anyone collects or report in any form. So what I do here is basically filter the sample of narrative using religious keywords, and then I read a random sample, coding myself whether they were or not religiously persecuted, which is arguably not something that's straightforward to do. You have to decide what is like a credible, what a statement about me being religiously persecuted. So there is some margin of decision here, but I tried to be consistent in this coding, and this is in this resulting sample what remained. And so that's for the main result. And so now moving to the second pattern that I can identify using this data. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question on this. So just before you move to the non-religious results, do you read this as a kind of Islamophobia result or a Christian preference?
So it's obviously impossible to tell with the data, right? You cannot pinpoint that, but the interpretation, at least at the French Asylum Office, would be a Christian preference. That's kind of the narrative where we have like Christians are have this special place in our heart, and therefore yes, they need this extra help. That's kind of how it was justified to me, but obviously impossible to tell, right? Because I'm not measuring the standard against which those decisions should be made, right? I'm not measuring persecution. What I'm trying to do is just control for everything that's in the file, basically.
Thanks.
And so moving now to the dynamic over time. So what I do is using the fact that I have this anonymous identifier of the bureaucrat in the administrative database, I can reconstruct the history of decision of those bureaucrats. And so that for each application in my sample, I know the order in which it was taken in the sequence of decisions made by those bureaucrats. So basically using the number of past decisions as a measure of experience, which variable that I've been into tercile, and looking at the effect of those characteristics within those bins. And so, for example, here, this would be the effect of an applicant reporting secondary or primary education compared to university among applications decided by bureaucrats who decided only 184 applications before. So relatively inexperienced bureaucrat, we have middle experience, and then more experienced bureaucrat in the third bin. And so basically here, the pattern is that this is, the pattern is for each of those characteristics, the effect of those characteristics is more negative in the first bin and then sort of diminishes over time. Yes, Max?
So your interpretation is that this is experience, but the alternative interpretation is that there's a new wave of people with different attitudes coming up. So someone who was, maybe an older generation, through the colonial era might have a different attitude towards asylum from those countries than, people who entered the job whatever, in 1980s or 90s, I don't know.
Yeah, so two things on that I should have made clear. So the first one is that I only know the identifier of the bureaucrat since 2000, so effectively reducing the sample to application filed since 2000. So that's the first point. And so this graph is using the full subsample of application filed in 2000, since 2000. So what I do in the paper is then try to get at what you suggest, which is that it's not that this pattern is not driven by experience, it's driven by composition effects. And so I do so by reducing the sample further to application examined by bureaucrats who stayed that long. So basically what I do is focus on the first two periods. And what I'm going to show you, the next table is focusing on the first two periods, so restricting the sample to the first 486 application of bureaucrats who filed at least that many, so that I know that the composition is relatively similar in the first and second bin. And so basically, before I get to the question, this is basically this table here, when I try to do several things, including so restricting the sample to the first 486 decision, and then further. And so what we see here is that the effect of compared to application examined by bureaucrats who are inexperienced, being examined by an experienced bureaucrat doesn't really improve things for Christians that much, but it does improve prospect of Muslim applicant. Basically, that's the pattern. Yeah.
So one question, in terms of how applications are allocated to bureaucrats, do you know if there is sort of uniform, it's the caseload, is it tend to be uniform, or does it vary a lot? And do these people have targets in terms of how much time do they have to process application? Because, you know, in a way, the resource constraint, so it could be important in determining how accurate they are in the decision-making process. So if they have a huge caseload, or if they are given targets in terms of time to process application, then when they are not experienced, they may just decide based on some prior belief because they simply don't have enough time.
Yeah, and I think that's the story I'm trying to tell. And so to your point, so so yes, so they do have limited time, right? So I mean, they haven't, when they enter, they are told some kind of target in terms of this is how many decisions you have to make, and so or like all of these applications are due at the end of the month. Basically, we see like this like monthly pattern. So yes, there is for most of the period under study, there is quite an important caseload. So it's difficult to compare, but so based on some data I gathered in the archives, we are here in an administration where bureaucrats do face a significant caseload, important caseload. And so yes, I think that's exactly the story I'm trying to tell, which is that and so I don't think it's incompatible with saying that it's about experience. And I do think that at first, basically what's happening is that the narrative is relatively uninformative for the reason mentioned before, which was that it's hard to judge a narrative on its credibility when you've seen only one or a couple. But as you read more and more of these, when you read a new narrative, you're more able to say this one's really different, and I'm going to believe that one. And then, but until you reach that step, then you're more inclined to use and rely on beliefs. That's basically what I think is going on. It's not something I can, test entirely, but that's something I think is going on. So that's actually the transition here, and sort of trying to figure out what can explain this pattern and what it is most consistent with. And so if we think that discrimination here is driven by test-based discrimination, so just to remind everyone, that would mean that we think that bureaucrats have a preference for applicants who are Christian, educated, and highly skilled. And in that case, the reduction over time would be explained by a change in preference over time. However, if we think that discrimination is driven here more by belief-based discrimination, sort of a more general term than statistical discrimination, because it could include both accurate, inaccurate belief, right? So it's just a more general form of statistical discrimination. But here the idea would be that bureaucrats overestimate the persecution suffered by applicants who are Christian, educated, and highly skilled for different reasons that could be well justified. But as they then learn and read more narrative, two things could happen. They could either correct these beliefs, or they could place smaller weight on them as they become more experienced. And so I can't test formally this, but I found anecdotal evidence consistent with the last mechanism, which is that over time they are more able to put more weight on the evidence. And so basically this is quite old. This is just, so I didn't have access to bureaucrats, couldn't conduct a survey of bureaucrats. I could have been authorized to talk to, if I had asked to talk to a number of asylum officers, but they would have been not obviously randomly chosen. So I didn't have access to any data on that front. So I'm using secondary quotes from other people who also did convenience sample. But basically, back in the 1970s already, this is a quote from someone working at the appeals court. So it's not someone from the French Asylum Office, but basically summarizing that what it means to be experienced is to be able to recognize when an applicant is lying. And so basically it takes time for the narrative to be informative. And so again, same paper, but here directly quoting one of those bureaucrat working at the appeals court. At first, you don't know what to look for, what to base your decision on. And so basically you rely on your beliefs. And then more recent, similar pattern, but more recently from a former asylum officer at the French Asylum Office, reporting that, when I started, my colleagues said, with experience, you will acquire that gift that is crucial to a profession, this indescribable feeling when an asylum seeker is lying. And so that's all I can say in terms of distinguishing those between those mechanisms, but it's not something that's possible to test more empirically. So I'm gonna stop here. I think that this study is making both empirical and theoretical contributions. So on the empirical side, this is the first individual level database. So individual and sort of complete database of asylum application, and also methodologically, I think using advances in machine learning apply them to causal inference. And so I think that the novelty here is to demonstrate this learning pattern, which I don't think has been quite identified yet in the literature on discrimination in bureaucracy. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very good, very good. So now we can move to a Q&A session. If there are any questions, please just unmute yourself and ask. I have a question or experience to share, but if you have any other. So I have two, one comment and one question. The question, maybe start with the question because it's super speculative. If you have this, machine learning technology, you could use it to shorten the experience gaining period for the new employees. You could tell them, okay, this is your decision, but look, the machine tells us this should be something else. I don't know. This can put some strange thoughts into people's heads in that office. But anyway, my comment is actually I spent my Friday dealing with special consideration cases of students here, and due to COVID, it was twice as many as normally, and I can say it takes us experience from that experience. I can tell you it takes experience to read between the lines, and it's very hard to do that. It is an indescribable feeling, like you had in one of the quotes, but that makes me also uncomfortable. The indescribable things or unmeasurable things could be also a way to open up this issue of discrimination. One of the critical things that I'm worried about is the discrimination between people who can write and people who don't have experience or do not have the network that will help them to write. The eloquent and the non-eloquent, the introvert and the extrovert, the convincing and the unconvincing. That is completely orthogonal to the actual cause of the asylum. Yeah. In my case, whether someone is ill or not among students. Yeah.
So point well taken, and I think maybe I should make that clear. Like, I'm measuring discrimination as defined by, same application, same result. And I'm not saying that, after a year, they make the perfect decision. And yes, it could open up to different sources of variation. I am controlling for, obviously, like the main concern was those who are able to write something eloquent or not would be also driven in large part by education, something I control for. But yes, I'm not saying that they're making the best decision. But my target was discrimination, and for that I think this is already something. So yes, I agree with that. And then on your first point in terms of how could this be used at the French Asylum Office, so I was keen on continuing working with them, and I tried to make a proposal so that we see whether there is anything to be learned, and on different strategies to increase the learning period, as you mentioned. And I had different ideas, not necessarily, and so not necessarily directly using machine learning, but at least using data to fasten the process. And so one idea I had was to actually make the allow asylum officers to retrieve similar narrative faster, basically. So not necessarily saying, hey, this is what the algorithm would say, but saying like, here are, narrative from comparable cases, and up for you to decide. I had different ideas, but they didn't wish to continue collaboration on this project. So another idea would be to use this data to maybe set up a lab and see whether research assistant can learn faster. And given a substantive amount of money, I could do that. That's an idea I have, but probably not with asylum officers, I think.
Thanks. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question actually. So I guess so. Asylum requests, they come in waves, right? So there's going to be people with similar characteristics that arrives in waves as response, as a result of different shocks all over the world. So I'm just kind of wondering how that affects your estimates, especially when we think about, the different groups you're targeting. When they say, well, there's more Christian persecution, that's events that are very specific in time, and then you end up having a wave of Christians that leave, as opposed to Muslim asylum seekers in France, who may be quite a bit of them and more randomly distributed over time.
Mm-hmm.
So that introduces at the very least noise, and I think maybe some estimation problems that I'm wondering how you deal with.
Yeah, I think to that point, I think the way to address this concern would be to zoom in on the time period and countries of origin. And I think this is what I'm trying to do when I control for country time, country year, fixed effects, sort of making the comparison even within country year cells, basically. So comparing not Christian who arrived early to Muslims who arrived later, but even restricting the comparison to even more comparable, and then similarly using a match sample. Now, in terms of whether there is something else that is due to the different distribution of applicant over time, I'm not sure how that would play. Like I'm not zooming in within year, basically. That would be like, that's where I stop. But I am making those within country 2-3 years bin, right?
Yeah. It just, there's it's not clear in my head either, but just adding these two-way fixed effects in the estimation, you end up kind of creating an event study, and the estimation problems of these sort of event studies are quite they're well known in the literature now. So I was just wondering whether you had explored that problem.
Yeah, the question is, how do you average those all of these differences you're measuring within country year bin?
And here you're going to have bins that, I suppose some of them have nobody who's a Christian or nobody who's a Muslim, or I don't know.
Yeah. So that's why I also do the match sample. So in the match sample, I'm down to less than half of the sample, and I'm only keeping Christian and Muslim from the same country 2-3 year set. So I think this is a complement to the country year. I mean, like, yes, I should look into the way to sort of correct for those averaging of treatment effect in the country year interaction regression, but I think the match sample, I think, addresses that, right?
Thanks.
Okay, I think it's a good time to officially finish the presentation. Thank you, Mathilde, for an excellent talk, and the audience for joining us today. We are going to stop the recording now, but please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to stay and keep chatting. Can I ask you